Mom, Dad, it's not fair. You ever heard that before? Have you ever had that said to you? If you're a parent, I bet that you have. Maybe you've said it to somebody. Maybe you said it to your parents. I had a teacher in high school, and this is probably a common complaint in the school system, but we would often say to this teacher, hey, that's not fair. Maybe we were unhappy with a pop quiz or something like that. And this teacher would always respond the same way. He would say, the fair's in August. I don't think he much cared whether or not we thought something was fair. You know, we were created with, we have this innate sense within us for things to be fair, for them to be just, to be right. And the story that we're going to look at today, it's a parable that Jesus told. It pushes that button within us for things to be fair, for them to be equal. We're continuing our series that we've called Grace Isn't Good at Math, how grace doesn't follow rules. Grace doesn't always make sense. And we're going to be in Matthew chapter 20 today, looking at a parable that Jesus told a group of people that would make us question, hey, is that fair? Here's what we read. This is Matthew chapter 20. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the workers on 1 denarius, he sent them into his vineyard for the day. When he went out about 9 in the morning, he saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He said to them, you also go into my vineyard, and I'll give you whatever is right. So off they went. About noon and about 3, he went out again, and he did the same thing. Then about 5, he went and found others standing around and said to them, why have you been standing here all day doing nothing? Well, because no one hired us, they said to him. You also go into my vineyard, he told them. Okay, let's stop right there for a minute. Let's talk about some of the things that are happening here. We need to understand what Jesus is doing. He's telling another one of his parables. We looked at one of those last week. Remember that a parable is a story that's used to illustrate some sort of point. And so he gives this parable that everybody can relate to. We can understand about working and being hired and earning a wage. And he's telling this parable in order to do what? Well, among other things, he's going to tell his listeners, and by extension us, he's telling us a little bit about what the future will be like, the future that awaits his followers, right? He starts by saying the kingdom of heaven is like. He's going to tell us something about God. That's the landowner. He's going to tell us something about ourselves. We're the workers. And then he's going to tell us something about grace. And that's the denarius. Now, in this story, we have an owner who's searching for workers. And Jesus doesn't give a specific starting time to this story, but normally the day would have started around 6 a.m. So they would have worked a full day of about 12 hours. So the landowner heads out about 6, the very beginning of the day, comes to an agreement with some of the laborers to pay a denarius for a day's work. Now, what's a denarius? It was a type of money, just a coin that had some value that was used back then. Then the owner heads back out about every 3 hours, and he continually hires a new group every few hours until he goes back out one more time with just 1 hour left in the day around 5 p.m., and he hires one last bunch. Now, notice how in the very first conversation with that 6 a.m. group, the owner comes to an agreement of what he's going to pay them. He's going to pay them the 1 denarius for the day's work. But in every other agreement after that, every other conversation, they're not specific terms that are discussed. There's the phrase used, just I'll pay you whatever is right. The last group, there isn't even a mention of that. It's just go on out and get to work. Now, as you're reading through this first part of the parable, there might be a question or two that comes up in your mind, like, why didn't the landowner just hire everybody all at once? This doesn't seem to be a very efficient way to run a farming operation. And why are there workers who still need to be hired? Or, were they lazy? Are they avoiding work? What was going on here? Well, hang on to both of those questions because I think there is an answer to them. But let's get back to the text. Let me keep reading now, verse 8. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard told his foreman, call the workers and give them their pay, starting with the last and ending with the first. When those who were hired, about 5, came, they each received 1 denarius. So, when the first ones came, they assumed they would get more. But they also received a denarius each. When they received it, they began to complain to the landowner. These last men put in 1 hour, and you made them equal to us, who bore the burden of the day's work and the burning heat. So the day's over. You can imagine now there's some sort of line. It's the end of the day. They're hot. They're tired. Some of them have been working all day, and they gather up in order to receive their paychecks. They didn't have direct deposit back then. They start with the workers who had only been there an hour, and they're probably expecting a fraction of what the other workers were going to get, right? That would make sense. That's what math would say. But instead, they get 1 full denarius. So then you've got the group that's in the back of the line. They have been there all day. Not 1 hour, but 12 long, tiring, hot hours of hard work. And they hear, or maybe word gets passed down, somehow they figure out what the 1 hour folks got paid. So they figure that they're going to get more. That makes sense, right? Again, that's what's fair. That's what math would say. But what happens? Well, they too just get the 1 denarius. Now, that's what they had agreed upon. Yet, when that happens, they have an understandable reaction, right? You know, we only get the 1. I mean, those guys were here 1/12 of the time of us, and they got 1 as well. What is going on here? What is the deal with that? Hey, that's not fair. You know, how would that make you feel if you were in that scenario? Probably unfair, right? It'd be unjust. Of course we would feel that way. But look at what the landowner says in response. Now, verse 13. He replied to one of them, "Friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Didn't you agree with me on a denarius? Take what's yours and go. I want to give this last man the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with what is mine? Are you jealous because I'm generous? So the last will be first and the first last." You know, there's just something about this story, if we had been in this situation, that can irritate us. Right? Especially if we are in the shoes of the laborers who had been there all day. Why? Because it's not right. It's not fair. So many things in our lives are centered around being fair. That's a lot of how our wages work, right? You go work at the local McDonald's, you're going to make an hourly wage. If you go and you work 5 hours, you're going to get paid your hourly wage times 5. Whereas if someone else comes and they work 8 hours, they would expect to get paid 8 times their hourly wage. Think about when you're at the grocery store and the line is really long. That is built around a system of fairness, right? Whoever's been waiting the longest, they get to go next. You ever been waiting in line and you've seen somebody cut the line? What's our immediate reaction to that? Hey, they stop. That's not fair. That's not right. Why? They haven't been waiting as long as I have. Why do they get to go first? Maybe when you buy presents for your kids at Christmas time, you try to do it fairly. You try to spend the same amount of money, or everybody gets the same number of presents. Everything's got to be fair. If not, you're probably going to hear about it. When I grew up as a kid, things had to be fair. And I might have told you this story before, but when we mowed the lawn, we had a section, and I was going to show you the Google Earth view, but there was actually too much tree cover for you to see. So I went online and I actually found a couple of pictures from when somebody tried to sell this house a few years ago. This is my childhood home. This is where I grew up. This is in a little town called Xenia in the state of Ohio. We'd actually divided this lawn into what we thought were fair, equal sections. The front yard was one section. And then in the backyard there, now we didn't have that swing set or the playground in it, but the right-hand side was the second section up until about where the garage started. And then the left-hand side of the backyard was section number 3. It's a little hard to tell from the picture, but it was a narrower section, so you had to mow that left-hand side and up around the garage. And I can't tell you probably how many arguments we got in as brothers because, there were very specific spots where my my section stopped and yours was going to start. And you better be sure that I wasn't going to let my mower drift into your side because I wasn't going to do your job. I was only going to do what was mine. That's fair. And we would get into arguments. We had one of those mowers that had the bag attached for the clippings. Were you supposed to empty the bag after your turn or before your turn started? And then did you have to rehook the bag or did you just set it there? Because everything had to be exactly fair. And we created this spreadsheet with a rotating system. So this week I mowed section 1, and then next week I mowed section 2, and then 3, and so on. So you get the idea. I think we really overcomplicated this because we were stuck on the idea of fairness instead of maybe trying to serve one another. The laborers had this reaction: that's not fair. And so for everyone to receive the same pay regardless of the amount of time that they had been there, it's not fair, it's not just, it just doesn't seem right. So what's Jesus' point? What is he trying to communicate in this story? Well, remember what we said he was trying to do. Jesus is trying to tell us a little bit about the future, about God, about ourselves, and about grace. So in this story, the working day equates to our life on earth, and the end of the day and what happens after that represents eternity. And we didn't cover the immediate context of this parable, but Jesus is telling this story immediately after the rich young ruler comes to him and asks what he has to do in order to have eternal life. We did talk about that story in week 1 of this series. And Jesus tells him to sell everything that he has and give it to the poor, and then he'll have treasure in heaven. In other words, he says to him, sacrifice now, you'll receive glorious reward later. And the disciples listened to this, and shortly after they asked Jesus, well, what do we get? We've sacrificed everything that we had, and we have followed you. We've left everything behind. What is there going to be for us? And shortly after this parable of the wages, later on in chapter 20, a couple of the disciples ask if they can sit next to Jesus in heaven. Everybody seems to be trying to position themselves for the greatest reward. They're expecting some sort of fair system based on their works, on their time, on their efforts. Now, let's pause and talk for a minute about the denarius. I think understanding that is part of the key to understanding this parable. I mentioned that denarius here is symbolic of grace or salvation. What was the denarius worth? Now, there is just a little bit of debate on this issue. You might have commonly heard it referred to as a day's wage, like maybe for like a Roman soldier. And some of the historical reading that I've done in research for this parable indicates that this was true for a time, but it was actually just a brief time. A denarius was typically worth more than just a day's wage. It would have been a sufficient living wage for anywhere from 4 to 5 days to maybe even a couple of weeks, depending on geographical location and a few other factors. Now, why is that important? So think about the situation that these temporary workers, these day laborers, that they would have found themselves in. They didn't have a steady job. They had to work in order to eat. In order to be able to feed their families, they had to have somebody that would come along and hire them. They're probably a little bit desperate. They certainly aren't in any position to negotiate. No one else has hired them. And along comes a landowner who says, come with me. Work a day and I'll pay you a denarius. Now, regardless of exactly how much that was worth, this is an unusually generous offer to people in this position. So they must be sitting there thinking like, wow, we have just hit the jackpot. Did you hear what he said? Did we hear that correctly? Did we hear the same thing there? They must have been thrilled with their good fortune, and they would have agreed right away. Yes, absolutely, I'll come work for you. Now, fast forward to the end of the story. Now they're saying, well, that isn't fair. That isn't right. Well, wait a second. If they are suddenly worried about fairness, then they shouldn't have received what they did in the first place. Grace is like that. Here's the one equation that I'm going to give you this week that doesn't work in math class. It's that grace does not equal fair. God's grace is generous, it is undeserved, and it should knock us right off our feet because it's not fair. And that is the best news that we are ever going to hear. We don't want grace to be fair. Like, what would be fair for us as sinners? What is just? What is right here? Right? Romans 6 says the wages of sin is death. Totally fair, unbiased justice means that an almighty, holy God condemns us as sinners to an eternity spent in hell, living with no hope, because we could never repay the offenses that we have caused against him. That would be fair. See, fair means that Jesus never has to die for the things he never did. Fair means that we all fall short of the glory of God. Fair means that God would operate with a works-based justice system. Now, a works-based justice system, that might work for you, except for two reasons. Reason number one, there is always someone who would work harder than you, who would study more than you, who would pray more than you, who would have more faith than you. And maybe you could get yourself to the middle or even the top third of the pack. But you would be stuck continually trying to earn it, continually trying to stay where you are in the rankings, so to speak. Never mind if you got a late start in life. Then you would really have no chance to put yourself up at the top of the list. But the second, really the more important reason why a works-based justice system wouldn't work is that the standard by which we would be measured isn't against each other. It's against the holy, infinite, righteous creator of the universe, the Almighty God. And against that standard, if we want it to be fair, we would have no chance. See, by its very definition, God's grace in salvation is unfair. That is, God's unmerited, unearned, undeserved favor, that's grace, isn't fair. If it was fair, it wouldn't be grace. Grace means Jesus did die as the sinless, spotless Son of God for the sins of the whole world, to satisfy a debt that I could never repay. So grace means God did not leave us with no hope, but he sent his Son to rescue us and to be the living hope. And whether you were hired at the start of the day or with just 1 hour to go, his grace is more than we could ever ask for or imagine. And we don't ever want to lose sight of that. A little bit ago, I asked why the landowner didn't just hire everybody all at once. Why keep coming back? Now, I don't know for sure, but I would offer this. Jesus is reminding us that he always stands ready. It is never too late in the day to come to him. He's always now hiring, if I could say it that way. And like the criminal on the cross that we looked at in week 1, who at the very last moment trusted in Jesus, God's grace is sufficient for all. But friends, like in this parable, lest we delay this decision, there will come a point in time when the workday will end. The hiring, so to speak, will stop. And you'll no longer have that option. I would plead with you, if that is you, don't wait. Don't delay any longer. Turn to him and accept the grace that he offers freely to you. Rejoice in the fact that grace isn't fair, and that is tremendous news. For those of you that have accepted the grace that God offers and have put your faith in Jesus, come away renewed and amazed at that marvelous, miraculous grace. And set out this week to tell one person about that grace. To let others know But there's a guy who's looking for some laborers. And he will reward you in ways beyond comprehension. Tell others what God has done for you.